Okay, so my friend Triceratops for Life, he originally made a video where he said James Charles 100 times. And then I made a response video where I said James Charles at least 200 times. And then he made a response video where he said James Charles 222 times. And the first time he only said James Charles 95 times, something like that, not exactly 100. But then this time he actually said James Charles exactly 222 times. So congratulations on that. And to make sure I get at least 300, I have a piece of paper right here to tally down how many times I say James Charles. So why are we doing this? How long are we going to make this go on for? Until it gets to like, oh my goodness, like 69,420, something like that. Okay, let's go. James Charles, 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 James Charles. This is hard already. Why could it be someone else? Why does it have to be James Charles? James Charles is so hard to say. James Charles, 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 James Charles. Oh man. I'm at 90 right now. Oh Jesus, it's already at 2. Oh wow, this is gonna be a long video. James Charles, 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 James Charles. 100. James Charles, 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 James Charles. James Charles, 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 James Charles. James Charles is so hard to say. Next time I'm just gonna say "Hey sisters" instead. Oh, it's so hard. James Charles, James Charles, James Charles, James Charles, James Charles. James Charles, 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 James Charles. Let's see. We're at 210 right now. Okay. James Charles, 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 James Charles. Just beat you, but I'm gonna still go to 300. James Charles, 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 James Charles. James Charles, 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 James Charles. 265 so far, we're almost there. James Charles, 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 James Charles. 285. James Charles, James Charles, James Charles, James Charles, James Charles. James Charles, 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 James Charles. And I think I just hit 300. Let me check. Yes, I just said it, James Charles 300 times. I beat you, Triceratops for life. And James Charles is really hard to say. You can probably agree that with me. Same James Charles, James Charles, James Charles, James Charles, over and over and over. It's not very much fun. It's very hard to say. So next time, if you decide to respond to me, can we please say "Hey Sisters" instead? Because "Hey Sisters" is so much easier. Hey sisters, 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 hey sisters. You know what? Whatever. You can either do "Hey Sisters" or James Charles. I don't care. They're both pretty hard to say, but whatever. I really hope you don't respond to me because I don't want to say James Charles 400 times, but whatever. You can do that if you want. Yeah, I tallied 300 times. Good luck if you want to say James Charles 400 times. I know you're gonna say like 301 because you're a noob and you don't want to go any much higher. You want to do as low as possible. But guess what? I said James Charles 88 times. 88 times more than you did last time. And you only did it 22 times more than I did last time. Get wrecked, noob.